string displayed at the bottom right of the desktop that identifies the OS as Windows Whistler 2001 Professional. This lets us know a couple of things. Obviously, Whistler is the codename for this release, but this specific build is a professional variant. The year 2001 being present indicates that Microsoft already had the release date for the final version of this OS in mind. In this build, we can see the beginnings of Microsoft merging certain visual elements from the home and professional releases of Windows. While Windows 2000's Explorer looked like this, Whistler 2211's bears a resemblance to Windows Me's Explorer. Another large UI change can be seen in the control panel, where an early version of the category view is present. This is an interface that we would see in XP, and it would combine certain control panel applets into categories. The implementation here, however, only shows the most commonly used control panel options and doesn't group anything into categories. And yes, you're still able to access the classic control panel layout by clicking on a link in the sidebar, just like in XP. We also see the reappearance of the login screen seen in Neptune build 5111. It's not enabled by default though, but you can easily modify a registry key to get access to it. Next up, let's take a look at Whistler build 2250, a technical beta build compiled on June 28, 2000. While the initial setup still looks the same, there is a new option to have setup automatically configure most aspects of the installation, but selecting this option just causes the system to blue screen. The next phase of setup has been redesigned to look more like Windows Me's, just with the Whistler branding. There are still some references to Windows 2000 though, as seen on the title bars, and for the most part the wizard itself has remained unchanged. So essentially this is like a 2000 setup wizard with a Windows Me setup background. Unlike in Me's setup though, we don't have the estimated time remaining clock in the sidebar, and the steps have been reduced from 5 to 3. The boot screen also remains the same, but the branding seen on first boot has been changed. The build string on the desktop loses the year, and the welcome screen is now enabled by default after the first boot. The branding changes continue into the start menu, where we can see that the sidebar has been updated to say Codename Whistler. We see a new option to log off, and a new icon for the shutdown button. One of the biggest changes in this build is seen in display properties. Not only is there a new Themes tab, but there is an entirely new visual style. It's known as Professional in this build, but would later be referred to as Watercolor in future builds. This visual style was actually a placeholder one, and was not intended to be in the final release of XP. Going into the control panel, we can see that an all-new design is present here as well. The category view now has actual categories and behaves similarly to the final implementation in XP. It's the same story with the user account properties. My computer gets a redesign as well, but the rest of Explorer looks just like what we saw in the last build. Something of note, even though this is a professional build, the default installation directory is now named Windows as opposed to WinNT. Another small visual change is seen on the desktop. When you select icons, a larger square will surround it. This is not how selecting icons behaves in XP, but it would be seen in Windows Vista. 2250 also contains a couple of hidden features. By going into the Start menu properties, pressing Alt-D and clicking Apply, a new 2-column Start menu will be enabled. The design fits in really well with the new theme. For the most part, the layout of it is similar to XP's, aside from the power options being placed at the top right. The shutdown menu also gets a redesign. The other hidden feature can be found in the C Windows Web folder, where there is an HTML file called Start Page. This is another experimental user interface, and the design of it is similar to the activity centers that we saw in Neptune. Another redesign can be seen on the welcome screen. And interestingly enough, there is another user account on the system by default. It doesn't have a standard name, but we can see the words Microsoft Corporation, Redmond, and Washington. It's password protected though, but we can remove the password from the user account settings and log into it. It just appears to be a standard user account though. Whistler build 2267 is another technical beta build compiled 3 months after 2250. The initial setup now identifies itself as Windows Whistler, and the second phase of the setup received some changes as well. While the overall design looks just like what we saw in the last build, there is an added step to the sidebar. The setup also loses most of the Windows 2000 branding. There would be one more setup redesign before what we'll see in the next build we discuss. One of the more noticeable changes in 2267 is the boot screen, which has been redesigned. The professional or watercolor theme is now enabled by default and also gets updated along with the start menu. Most of the elements are in the right place, but it is missing the username and picture that would appear at the very top in the final release of XP. 2267 also has another feature that we would see in the final release of XP, fast user switching. The ability to quickly switch between user accounts without having to completely log off. Alright, our next build to discuss is 2428, a pre-beta 2 build compiled in January of 2001. There's a lot to talk about in this build, as it brings some major user interface overhauls. After the setup copies files and restarts, we are greeted with the all-new boot screen. I've said this before in other videos, but this is probably my favorite Windows boot screen of all time. It's something about its design, the way it fades in and out, and how the Windows logo colors are in the progress bar. I think it's very unique. XP would obviously replace this. It's also worth noting that this is the earliest known build to introduce the new Windows flag design. However, there are areas where the old Windows flag is still present, like in the next phase of setup. This gets a redesign as well, looking very close to what we would see in the final release of XP. There are a couple of minor differences though. The checkboxes on the left side would be replaced with radio buttons, and the progress animation at the bottom right would be changed. Another huge modification is seen after setup finishes, when Windows launches into an out-of-box experience. A short video will play, accompanied by the Windows 2000 startup sound, and then will be brought to a screen that again looks very close to XP's out-of-box experience. Although we still see the old Windows flag at the top left, and the assistant present is Merlin, as opposed to the animated question mark seen in XP. Unfortunately, the famous title.wma soundtrack is not here. Speaking of things seen in XP, here's the new welcome screen. Yes, this looks identical to XP's welcome screen, aside from the logo at the top and the fact that the welcome text displays. In XP, you would only see this text when you selected your user account and were in the process of logging in. After you log in, you'll be hit with some major changes on the desktop. Yes, the Luna theme is here, known simply as the Whistler style, and the previous watercolor theme is gone. Now, this version of the Luna theme has some differences to what we saw in the final release of XP. Taskbar buttons for opened windows are not as pronounced, and the taskbar itself is not locked by default. The Start button also has a slightly different design. As for the design of Explorer and Control Panel, they are coming together, just with some different icons in certain places. Buttons above Explorer's address bar also look different, and yes, this build contains some newer XP icons, but some of the old ones remain. The Recycle Bin icon on the desktop is actually completely different. It may be hard to tell at first, but there are handles on each side of the bin which are not present in XP's version of this icon. The desktop wallpaper has been changed to Red Moon Desert by default, but would be replaced in favor of the famous Bliss wallpaper for the final release. Fun fact, both of these photographs were taken by the same photographer, Charles O'Rear. And Red Moon Desert was initially intended to be the default wallpaper. However, it was changed when Microsoft received a couple of complaints about it.